Sometimes the past doesn't announce itself, doesn't ride in with guns drawn or knock polite on your door. Sometimes it just shows up in your kitchen one morning, humming a song you thought you'd buried 10 years ago. And when that happens, when recognition hits like a bullet you didn't see coming, you've got two choices: run from it again, or finally stand still and face what you did. This is a story about a woman who spent 6 months cooking breakfast for the man who destroyed her village. Neither of them knew, not at first. She thought he was just another rancher who didn't ask questions. He thought she was just another drifter who needed work. Then she sang, and everything changed. This is the story of Ines Delgado and William Garrett, a survivor and a soldier, a cook and a captain. Two people whose lives collided once in blood and ash, then collided again in bacon grease and coffee. And what happened when the second collision forced them to decide: keep running from the past or finally drag it into daylight where it couldn't hide anymore. Let's go back to Wyoming, 1878, to a midnight when everything that had been buried was about to come home.
The prairie smelled like sage and frost, and the particular kind of silence that comes when you're 3 days past anything that could be called civilization. The ground under Ines Delgado's boots was hard-packed and unforgiving, the kind of earth that remembered every footfall and gave nothing back. Her breath came white in the October air, visible proof she was still alive, even when her body had started arguing that point somewhere around dawn. She'd been moving for 72 hours, not traveling, not journeying. Moving the way wounded animals move when the scent of blood draws predators, and stillness means death. Her dress, once decent, once blue, hung in tatters around her knees. Dirt caked her calves. A gash above her left temple had stopped bleeding hours ago, but still pulsed hot whenever her heart remembered to beat hard. The silver locket at her throat was the only clean thing she carried, polished by 10 years of her fingers, worrying it like a rosary. Behind her, distant but closing, came the sound that had been following her since Tuesday. Hoofbeats, not the casual rhythm of travelers, the measured, patient drumming of men who knew their horses could outlast a woman on foot and weren't in any particular hurry to prove it. The sound came first, a rifle crack, sharp and clean, cutting the night like a blade through silk. The bullet hit Sage 20 feet to her left, close enough that she smelled the powder burn, far enough that she knew it was a warning, not an attempt. They wanted her alive. That was worse. Ines altered course without breaking stride, angling toward the dark shapes she'd spotted on the horizon when moonrise gave her enough light to see by. Buildings, corrals, the skeletal outline of a windmill turning slow against stars that didn't care whether she lived or died. A ranch, which meant people, which meant witnesses who might make soldiers think twice about what they did and how they explained it later. Or it meant a place to be cornered. Either way, she was out of choices. Her vision had started to tunnel an hour ago. Her legs had stopped feeling like they belonged to her sometime after that. Now she moved on something that wasn't quite will and wasn't quite desperation, but lived in the space between them. The part of survival that doesn't ask permission, just keeps the body moving when the mind has given up arguing. The gate appeared sudden and solid. She hit it hard enough to rattle wood, scrabbled at the latch with hands that had forgotten how to grip properly. Got it open. Stumbled through into a yard that smelled like horses and hay and wood smoke. Behind her, the hoofbeats stopped. Voices carried through the dark. Men arguing in tones too low to make out words, but not low enough to hide the disagreement. Someone said her name. Someone else said something about jurisdiction and paperwork, and how explaining a body on private land created problems nobody wanted. Light spilled across the yard. The ranch house door had opened. A man stood there, backlit by lamplight that turned him into a silhouette. Tall, broad through the shoulders, a rifle held easy in hands that clearly knew its weight. His voice came calm and steady, cutting through the night like he'd done this before, and wasn't particularly worried about doing it again. "This is private property. State your business or ride on." The soldiers at the gate went quiet. Ines could feel their calculation, could almost hear the mathematics of whether one fugitive woman was worth the complication of violating property rights belonging to someone who clearly wasn't intimidated by uniforms. She didn't wait to find out which way they'd decide. Her knees buckled. She caught herself on the porch railing, held on while her vision grayed at the edges, and her body informed her, politely but firmly, that it was done. That 3 days was the limit. That if she wanted to keep existing, she needed to stop moving right now. Ines looked up at the man in the doorway, tried to speak, managed something that might have been help, or might have been nothing. Her voice had stopped working properly, somewhere around day 2. Then the ground came up to meet her, and the night turned the particular kind of black that comes right before you stop being conscious. She woke to lamplight and the smell of whiskey. Her head rested on something soft. A pillow, she realized slowly. The concept, almost foreign, after 3 nights on hard ground. A blanket covered her to the chin, heavy and warm, and smelling faintly of cedar. Her boots were gone. Someone had cleaned the blood from her face. Ines's hand moved to her throat. The locket was still there. Relief hit so hard it made her dizzy. Or maybe that was the head wound. She couldn't tell. She tried to sit up. The room tilted sideways. A hand, large, calloused, gentle, pressed her shoulder back down. "Easy," said a voice. Male. The same voice from the doorway. "You cracked your head pretty good when you fell. Doctor says you need to stay still." Ines turned her head slow, careful. The man sat in a chair beside the bed, backlit now by a lamp on the table instead of the door. She could see his face for the first time, weathered, mid-50s, gray threading his beard, eyes that had seen enough that one more unconscious woman on his porch probably didn't rank high on the list of strange things life had thrown at him. "The soldiers," Ines managed. Her voice came out rough as gravel. "Gone," the man said. "Told them I didn't know anything about a fugitive woman, and they were welcome to come back with a warrant if they felt like testing whether I was lying." He paused. "They didn't feel like it." Ines studied him, looking for the trap. Men didn't help women for free. There was always a cost, always something they wanted, always a moment when kindness revealed itself to be something else wearing a pleasant mask. "Why?" she asked. "Why what? Why help me?" The man considered the question like it actually required thought. "Because you were bleeding on my porch, and those soldiers looked like they were planning something I didn't want happening on my property." He shrugged. "And because I've done enough things I'm not proud of that when a chance to do something decent shows up, I try to take it." The answer was honest enough to be suspicious. "What do you want?" Ines asked. "For you to rest until the doctor says you can stand without falling over." He stood, moved toward the door. "There's water on the table. Food when you're ready. Outhouse is behind the main house. You can stay as long as you need to heal up." And then, Then you're free to go wherever you're headed. He paused at the door. Or if you need work, my cook died last month. Kitchen needs running and 3 dozen ranch hands need feeding. Job's yours if you want it. Comes with a room and wages. Ines blinked. You're offering me work. If you want it. No obligation either way. You don't even know me. I know you're running from something. I know you're hurt and tired and probably haven't had a decent meal in days. William shrugged. And I know the best cooks I've ever had were people who had reasons not to answer questions about where they came from. Seems to give food more flavor when it's made by someone who understands hunger. Before Ines could respond, he continued. Think about it. No pressure. Recover first. Decide later. He left, closing the door quiet behind him. Ines lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. A job. A room. Wages. The kind of stability she hadn't had since soldiers had burned her village to ash 10 years ago. It was too easy. Too convenient. Too much like the universe offering something that would definitely have a cost she couldn't see yet. But she was tired. God, she was tired. Tired of running. Tired of sleeping in alleys and barns. Tired of moving through the world like a ghost that people looked through instead of at. Maybe just for a while. Just until she healed. Just until winter passed and spring made traveling easier. Just until. 3 days later, Ines walked into the ranch kitchen wearing a borrowed dress and the same silver locket. Her head still ached, but the dizziness had passed. The gash had scabbed over clean. William sat at the table with coffee and a ledger, doing the kind of arithmetic that came with running a cattle operation. He looked up when she entered. Feeling better? Better enough. Ines looked around the kitchen. Cast iron stove, rough-hewn table, shelves stocked with flour and beans and coffee. Familiar territory. She'd worked kitchens before, in the spaces between running. I'll take the job. Through winter at least. Fair enough. William stood, pulled a key from his pocket. This opens the pantry and the smokehouse. Foreman's name is Dutch. He'll tell you how many hands we're feeding on any given day. Breakfast at 6, dinner at 6. Anything else is your call. He handed her the key. Their fingers didn't touch. One rule, William said. I don't ask where you came from or what you're running from. You don't have to tell me your full name or your history or anything you don't want to share. You work, you get paid. Your business is your own. Ines nodded slowly. And if those soldiers come back, then they'll need a warrant and a better reason than they had last time. William's voice carried the weight of a promise he intended to keep. You're under my employment. That means something out here. Why? Ines asked again. Why take that risk for a stranger? William was quiet for a long moment, staring at his coffee like it held answers he didn't particularly want to find. Because 10 years ago, I was a soldier, he said finally. And soldiers follow orders even when those orders are wrong. And when you spend enough years living with what you did because someone told you to do it. He stopped, started again. Let's just say I sleep better at night when I make choices I can defend on my own merit instead of pointing at someone else's authority. The answer sat between them, heavy with things unsaid. Ines tucked the key into her pocket. I'll have breakfast ready at 6 tomorrow. Appreciate it. She turned to inventory the kitchen. William went back to his ledger, and that was how it started. Not with grand declarations or deep understanding. Just two people agreeing to exist in the same space without asking the questions that would make that existence uncomfortable. 6 months passed. Ines cooked. Breakfast at 6. Eggs, bacon, cornbread, coffee. Dinner at 6, stew or roast or whatever the season, and the smokehouse provided. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, learned which hands had appetites that required extra portions and which ones picked at their food like birds. She learned William took his coffee black and his bacon crisp and didn't talk much in the mornings. Learned he paid wages fair and on time, didn't tolerate waste, and fired a hand who got drunk and aggressive with one of the younger workers without hesitation or second chances. She learned the Double Creek Ranch was run decent, which made staying easier than it should have been. William, for his part, learned almost nothing about his cook. She was efficient, quiet, kept the kitchen cleaner than it had been in years. The food was good, not fancy, but solid and plentiful and made with the kind of care that spoke of someone who understood the difference between feeding people and just putting food in front of them. She hummed while she worked. Melodies he didn't recognize. Never with words. He never asked about the locket she wore every day. Never polished, but clearly precious. Never asked why she flinched when horses moved too fast near the house. Never asked why she sometimes stared out the kitchen window at nothing for long minutes like she was seeing something that wasn't there anymore. He'd promised not to ask. He kept that promise. The arrangement worked, because neither of them wanted it to be anything more than what it was. A job, a paycheck, two people occupying the same space, without demanding pieces of each other they weren't willing to give. Until the morning, everything changed. It was a Tuesday. October. 6 months to the day since Ines had collapsed bleeding on William's porch. The air had turned sharp, autumn finally meaning something. Frost decorating the grass in patterns that would melt by noon. Ines stood at the stove, making pan bread, flour dusting her hands and apron, the skillet hissing when batter hit hot iron. And she sang. Not humming this time. Actual words. Soft, almost whispered, in Spanish. William didn't speak, but recognized as the language of ghosts. The melody drifted through the kitchen like smoke, like memory, like every ghost William had tried to bury under 5 years of honest ranching, and 10 years before that of telling himself he'd just been following orders. William's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. That song. He knew that song. Not the words, not the language, but the melody, the rhythm, the particular cadence of syllables that carved themselves into memory when you heard them in places where people were about to stop singing forever. Fort Bowie. Summer, 1868. Orders from a colonel who believed civilians harboring Apache scouts needed to learn lessons. William had been a captain then, 20 years old, and too green to question authority, too ambitious to risk his career on something as soft as mercy. He'd led 40 men into a village at dawn. By sunset, that village had been smoke and silence, and things William had spent 10 years trying not to remember clearly. A woman had been singing while grinding corn. This song, this exact melody. Her voice had carried across adobe walls into a morning that wouldn't survive past noon. William had heard it while positioning his men, had heard it stop when the first shots were fired, had spent a decade telling himself he couldn't possibly remember one woman's song from one village among dozens they'd cleared during the Apache campaigns. But he did remember. The melody had stayed, lodged somewhere deep, where guilt lived and couldn't be rationalized away. And now his cook was singing it, in his kitchen, 6 months after he'd given her shelter. William's mind raced through terrible mathematics. The cook who never met his eyes, who flinched at hoofbeats, who wore a locket she never took off, who hummed songs in Spanish from a place and time William had worked very hard to forget. His hands started shaking. Ines finished the verse and fell silent, turned to bring the bread to the table, and for the first time in 6 months, William actually looked at her face. Really looked. Not at the cook, not at the help, at the person. Dark eyes. Scar running from her left temple into her hairline. Old, faded. The kind that comes from shrapnel or a rifle butt connecting hard. Hands with calluses that spoke of work, but also of survival. And her age. 28 now, which meant she would have been 18 then. Old enough to remember. Young enough that 10 years wouldn't have erased what she'd survived. "Where did you learn that song?" William asked. His voice came out rougher than intended. Ines went very still. That particular kind of stillness that comes when you've just realized you've made a mistake and are calculating how fatal it might be. "My mother," she said carefully. "Where?" She looked at him now, brief, assessing, eyes that had learned to measure danger in the space between heartbeats. "A village," she said. "One that doesn't exist anymore." The words sat between them like stones. "What was it called?" William asked, though he already knew, could feel the answer sitting heavy in his chest, like a bullet that had finally found its mark. Ines's hand tightened on the dish towel she was holding. She could lie, could run, could pretend she didn't understand what he was asking. But she was tired. 10 years tired. Tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of making herself small and invisible and silent. "San Miguel de las Palomas," she said. The name hung in the air like gun smoke. William's breath left him all at once. That was the village. That name had been in his report, written in ink under location and objective, and status cleared. "You were there," he said. "Yes. I was—" William stopped, started again. "I was a captain. Captain William Garrett. Apache campaigns. Summer of 1868. He watched recognition dawn in her eyes, watched her take one step back, watched her hand move toward the kitchen knife on the counter. "You led them," she said. Not a question. Yes. The silence that followed was the kind that comes before storms break. Ines didn't pick up the knife, didn't run. Just stood there holding a dish towel while her entire world rearranged itself into a shape she'd been trying to avoid for 6 months. "I've been cooking your meals," she said finally, voice hollow. "For 6 months. You didn't know?" "No," she interrupted. "I didn't know it was you specifically. I knew this ranch was owned by former military. I knew you didn't ask questions. I didn't know you were the captain." Her laugh came bitter and sharp. "But I should have known, should have recognized something. The way you hold yourself, the way you give orders. Something. Ines, don't." She held up one hand. "Don't say my name like we're people who know each other. We're not. You're the man who killed my mother, who burned my village, who gave the orders that turned 18-year-old me into this," she gestured at herself, "into someone who's been running for 10 years because your report labeled survivors as insurgents." William felt every word land like a blow. "The reports said minimal resistance," he managed. "The reports lied." Ines's voice had gone cold, factual, the tone of someone reciting testimony she'd given 1,000 times in her own head. "There was no resistance. We weren't harboring Apache scouts. We were farmers, families. My mother was grinding corn. My brothers were fixing the church roof. And your men came at dawn and shot anyone who moved and burned anyone who didn't. We had orders. Everyone has orders. Ines cut him off. Orders don't absolve. They just make murder official. The truth of it hit William like falling. He'd spent 10 years telling himself he'd been following commands, doing his duty. That the blame sat higher up the chain, with colonels and generals who gave orders from offices hundreds of miles away. But he'd been the one on the ground, his hands on the reins, his voice giving commands, his choice to follow orders he could have questioned. "I'll pack my things," Ines said, setting down the towel with careful precision. "Be gone by noon." "No." She looked at him sharply. "No. Stay." "Why would I?" "Because you need the work," William said. "Because winter's coming and jobs are scarce, and you shouldn't have to run again just because I exist in the same territory." He paused. "And because you were right. I should have looked, should have seen you. 6 months you've been here, and I never once saw you as anything except someone who made my life easier." Ines stared at him like he'd grown a second head. "You want me to keep cooking for you, knowing what you did?" "I want you to have a choice," William said quietly. "That's all. You can leave if that's what you need, or you can stay, and every meal will be what it is, a reminder to me of what I did and who survived it. Either way, the choice is yours."
If you're following this story and you want to know what happens when guilt comes home wearing an apron, when the past stops being history and becomes the person cooking your breakfast, hit subscribe now. Because what comes next is the part where running stops being an option and two people have to decide whether to keep hiding from what happened or finally drag it into daylight where it can't stay buried anymore. Now back to that Wyoming kitchen where Ines Delgado was about to make a choice that would change everything.
Ines stood in the kitchen she'd worked for 6 months, staring at a man she'd fed every day, without knowing he was the one who'd destroyed her world. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to pack her things and disappear before this got more complicated, before staying became something she couldn't explain even to herself. But she was tired. 10 years of running tired. And something about the way William stood there. Not defending himself. Not making excuses. Just offering her the dignity of choice. Made leaving feel like letting him off easy. "I'll stay," she said finally. "Not because I forgive you. I don't. I won't. But because you're right. I'm tired of running. And if you're going to live with knowing who I am and what you took, then I'm going to make sure you feel every bit of it. Fair enough. I won't make this comfortable for you. I don't expect you to. And if I decide the knife is the better option, then that's my due," William said quietly. Ines nodded once, turned back to the stove. The pan bread had burned while they'd been talking. She scraped it into the slop bucket and started again. William sat back down at the table, his coffee long cold, his breakfast forgotten. Watched her work with movements that had become familiar over 6 months and were now charged with entirely different meaning. That night, neither of them slept well. 3 days passed, in tense, careful silence. Ines cooked. William ate. They existed in the same space, like two people who'd signed a treaty, neither fully trusted but both needed. She sang sometimes now, not hiding it anymore. Songs her mother had taught her. Each one a ghost, each one a reminder. William listened and carried the weight. On the fourth day, everything changed again. Hoofbeats announced visitors. 6 riders cresting the ridge at mid-morning. Military. An officer in front, 5 soldiers behind. William walked out onto the porch, cold dread settling in his gut. He recognized the officer even at a distance. Captain Vernon Hayes. They'd served together. Hayes had been at San Miguel de las Palomas. Hayes remembered. The riders stopped at the fence line. Hayes dismounted with the casual authority of a man who believed his uniform meant something everywhere he went. "Garrett," Hayes called. "Been a long time." "Vernon," William said, keeping his voice neutral. "What brings you out here?" Hayes pulled a folded paper from his coat. A wanted notice. Crude sketch of a woman's face. "We're tracking insurgents. Survivors from villages that supported Apache uprisings back in '68. Some have been making noise, talking to journalists, making accusations about military conduct." Hayes's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We have information that a woman named Ines Delgado, survivor of San Miguel de las Palomas, may be in this territory. Checking all ranches. Anyone harboring her faces federal charges." William's blood went cold. Behind him, through the kitchen window, he could feel Ines listening, could sense her calculating whether to run or stay or fight. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description," William said, voice steady despite his hammering heart. Hayes studied him. "Mind if we search your property? Standard procedure." "I do mind." Hayes's smile vanished. "This isn't a request. We can do this easy, or come back with a warrant that gives us authority to tear this place apart." William felt the trap closing. He could refuse, buy Ines time to run. But Hayes would return with more men and legal authority. William couldn't fight, or he could let them search. Let them find her. Watch them take her, and tell himself he'd had no choice. The same choice he'd made 10 years ago. Behind him, the kitchen door opened. Ines stepped onto the porch. She'd changed into riding clothes, her hair pulled back, and in her hand, barely visible against her skirt, was the kitchen knife. "I'm Ines Delgado," she said, voice carrying clear and strong. "And I'm not hiding anymore." Hayes's face split into a satisfied grin. "Well, that makes this easier." His men dismounted, hands moving to rifles. William felt everything inside him crystallize, come into a single moment of clarity. He'd spent 10 years running from what he'd done, spent 5 years trying to build something decent on a foundation of blood. Here was his choice, the real one. He stepped in front of Ines. "She's under my protection," William said. Hayes laughed. "You can't protect her, Garrett. We have legal authority. Your authority ended the day you started hunting civilians instead of soldiers," William interrupted. "Ines Delgado isn't an insurgent. She's a survivor, and the only crime she's committed is telling the truth about what we did to her village." "What we did?" Hayes's voice dropped dangerous. "You forgetting your duty, Captain?" "My duty," William said, "was to follow lawful orders. What we did at San Miguel wasn't lawful. It was murder. And I've spent 10 years trying to pretend otherwise." Hayes's hand moved to his sidearm. "You're making a serious mistake." "I made my mistake 10 years ago," William said. "Today I'm fixing it." The yard went silent. 6 armed soldiers. 1 former captain. 1 woman with a kitchen knife. Then Ines spoke, steady despite the fear radiating off her. "There's a journalist in Laramie," she said. "Samuel Cooper. He's been collecting testimony from massacre survivors. I sent him a letter 3 weeks ago detailing everything that happened at San Miguel de las Palomas. Names, dates, specific actions by specific officers. She paused. If anything happens to me, that letter becomes front-page news in every paper from here to Washington. Hayes's face darkened. You're bluffing. Am I? Ines smiled, cold and sharp. You want to find out what happens when a sitting captain's war crimes get published? I'll have you arrested for slander. Truth isn't slander, William said. And she's not alone in her testimony. Hayes turned to him slowly. What? I'll corroborate every word, William said. I was there. I led men into that village. I followed orders I knew were wrong. And I'll testify to all of it if you try to take her. The silence that followed was the kind before storms break. Hayes looked between them, calculating odds and consequences. You're both making enemies you don't want, Hayes said finally. Maybe, William replied. But I already am the enemy I don't want. This is me trying to be something else. Hayes remounted his horse. This isn't over. Yes, it is, Ines said. Unless you want the whole territory knowing what you did to women and children while wearing that uniform. Hayes's jaw worked. Then he spurred his horse and rode off, his men following. William and Ines stood on the porch until the dust settled. Then Inez's knees buckled. William caught her before she hit the ground. For the first time since she'd arrived, she let herself be caught. Let herself shake. Let herself be something other than the survivor who had to stay standing. He'll come back, she whispered. Let him, William said. Next time we'll be ready. They went inside. William poured whiskey with shaking hands. They sat at the table, the same table where he'd eaten breakfast while she'd been invisible for 6 months. Why? Ines asked. Why risk everything? William looked at his hands. Because 10 years ago, I had a choice, and I chose wrong. Today I had another one, and I chose you. Ines stared at him, searching for the trap. Found something else instead. Not forgiveness, not trust, but maybe the beginning of understanding that guilt, when wielded honestly, could cut through cowardice. They'll investigate, she said. Your testimony, mine. They'll try to bury it. Then we dig it back up. This could destroy you. I'm already destroyed, William said quietly. Have been since the day I watched your village burn. I just spent 10 years pretending I wasn't. Ines nodded slowly, drank her whiskey. Then we fight, she said. Together. Not because I forgive you, because survival means using every weapon we have. And right now, you're the only one with military testimony that matters. Fair enough. The weeks that followed were tense. William sent his testimony to Samuel Cooper in Laramie. Ines wrote her account in brutal detail. They compiled evidence that should have been gathered 10 years ago. Hayes didn't return, but his presence hung over the ranch like a threat. William hired extra hands, taught Ines to shoot, slept with his rifle within reach. The story broke in late November. Samuel Cooper ran it in the Laramie paper first, then it spread. Former captain testifies to massacre. Military whistleblower exposes Apache campaign atrocities. Survivor and soldier break decade of silence. The backlash was immediate. Veterans called William a traitor. Military brass tried to discredit both testimonies. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves, but the story didn't die. Other survivors came forward. The weight of testimony became impossible to ignore. A federal inquiry opened. Captain Vernon Hayes was reassigned to a desk, stripped of field command, his career effectively over. The colonel who'd given the original orders had died years ago, conveniently escaping consequences. But the truth was out. San Miguel de las Palomas was no longer just a line in military reports. It was a name, a place, a crime. William lost most of his military pension. Some veterans refused to do business with him. His ranch became known as the whistleblower's place. He didn't care, because when spring came and Ines planted a garden behind the kitchen, vegetables her mother had grown, herbs her grandmother had used, William watched from the porch and understood that some things were worth more than reputation. One evening in April, as sunset painted the mountains copper and gold, Ines brought coffee out to the porch and sat beside William. "The inquiry's closing," she said. "They'll issue a formal apology. Minor reforms. That's it." "Not enough," William said. "No," Ines agreed. "But my mother's name is in the record now. The village isn't erased. That's more than we had." They sat in silence, drinking coffee, watching the ranch settle. "I'm staying," Ines said. "Not for a season." Staying. William looked at her. "Why?" "Because running hasn't fixed anything. Because this place is where I learned to stop being invisible. Where I learned silence was just another way of dying." "And me?" William asked quietly. Ines looked at him, saw the man who'd destroyed her world and the man who'd risked everything to help her reclaim it. "I don't forgive you," she said. "What you did, that stays. But you chose differently the second time. That matters too." They finished their coffee as stars emerged. The ranch quieted. Somewhere distant, a coyote sang. Years later, someone asked Ines why she'd stayed. She smiled, complicated, carrying 10,000 meals cooked and 10,000 songs sung, and said, "Because he finally learned to look. And I finally learned that survival means planting gardens even in burned ground." The kitchen still smelled like bacon and coffee every morning. The songs still carried ghosts, but the ghosts had names now, had voices, had a place at the table where truth was served alongside breakfast, and that made all the difference.